What if one phone call could change the history of the whole world? Not a big speech, not a war announcement, just one phone call from one scared woman in a burning building. A woman named Elizabeth Swift picked up the phone inside the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. Her hands were shaking. Her voice was cracking. She called the U.S. government in Washington, D.C., and said just a few words. "Hundreds of people have jumped over our walls. They are inside our building. There's fire everywhere." And then she said 4 words that nobody ever wants to say. "We are going down." The line went dead. And just like that, 66 Americans inside that embassy became prisoners. Not in a war zone, not on a battlefield, inside their own embassy, in the middle of a city. Their eyes were covered with cloth, their hands were tied behind their backs, and then they were walked through the streets of Tehran while thousands of people screamed for their deaths. The whole world watched it live on television. The most powerful country in the world, America, could not save its own people. And those 66 people had no idea when or if they would ever go home. This is not just a story about a hostage crisis. This is a story about oil, power, betrayal, and revenge. About a fake Hollywood movie that saved 6 people from the most dangerous city on Earth. About a rescue mission that exploded in the desert before it even started. And about 444 days that broke a U.S. president, changed the Middle East forever, and left a wound that still has not healed today. Let's go back to the very beginning, because this story starts long before 1979. It starts with oil and greed and a decision that changed everything. Okay, imagine you have a treasure buried under your house. Gold, diamonds, something extremely valuable. But someone stronger than you comes, digs it up, takes it all, and gives you barely anything back. How would you feel? That is exactly what happened to Iran. In the early 1900s, a British company found something massive under the ground in Iran. Oil. Huge amounts of it. So Britain set up a company, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. You probably know it today as BP. And they made a deal with Iran that was completely one-sided. Iran had the oil, Britain had the power. So Britain took most of the money. Iran got almost nothing. While British people got rich, Iranian people stayed poor. For decades, year after year, while the oil kept flowing out of Iranian soil. Then, in 1925, a tough army general named Reza Shah took over Iran. He built roads, schools, factories. He tried to make Iran modern. But when World War II started, Britain got scared. They thought Reza Shah liked the Nazis. So they removed him, just like that, and put his young son, 21 years old, on the throne instead. That young man was Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi. He got a country full of problems, full of poverty, and full of anger at foreigners. So what happens when a nation watches its wealth get stolen for decades and nobody stops it? They find someone who is brave enough to say, "Enough." And in 1951, they found that person. His name was Mohammad Mossadegh, and he was about to shake the entire world. When Mossadegh became Prime Minister of Iran in 1951, he had one big idea. Iran's oil belongs to Iran, not to Britain, not to any foreigner. So he did something nobody expected. He nationalized the oil. He kicked Britain out. He said, "This oil is ours now." Iranians went crazy with happiness. Finally, someone was standing up for them. Mossadegh became the most loved man in Iran overnight. But Britain was furious. They had been making billions from that oil, and now this old man had taken it away. So Britain called their new powerful friend, America, and said, "We need help." And America said, "Yes." In August 1953, the CIA and British intelligence ran a secret operation in Iran. They paid people to start riots. They spread lies, calling Mossadegh a communist. They bribed army officers to turn against their own prime minister. Within days, the man Iranians loved most was arrested. He spent the rest of his life under house arrest, never free again. And the Shah, the young king who Britain and America liked, was put back in power. Now here is the most important thing to understand. The Shah knew that America had put him on his throne, so he did whatever America wanted. America was happy. Britain was happy. But ordinary Iranian people, they were not happy at all. The Shah used a brutal secret police called Savak, trained by the CIA, to arrest, torture, and kill anyone who spoke against him. People who complained disappeared in the middle of the night. Iranians lived in fear. They had no real freedom. But underneath all that fear, anger was building, slowly, quietly, like a volcano before it erupts. And there was one voice that kept the anger alive, a voice coming from cassette tapes passed secretly from hand to hand. The voice of a religious leader named Ayatollah Khomeini. His message was simple. The Shah is corrupt. America is the real enemy. And one day, we will take our country back. By 1978, that volcano finally erupted. Millions of Iranians came out into the streets. They burned American flags. They chanted, "Death to the Shah! Death to America!" The Shah tried everything to stop them. It did not work. On January 16, 1979, the Shah quietly packed his bags. He told people he was going on vacation. He never came back. 2 weeks later, Ayatollah Khomeini returned to Iran after 15 years in exile. 5 million people came out to welcome him. 5 million people. Within days, Iran was declared an Islamic republic. The king was gone. A revolution had won. But here's the thing. The hostage crisis still had not happened yet. For that, we need to jump to America and one decision that changed everything. After running away, the Shah moved from country to country, Egypt, Morocco, Mexico. He had cancer. He was getting worse every day. His friends, powerful American politicians and businessmen, begged President Jimmy Carter, "Let the Shah come to America for medical treatment." Carter's own advisors warned him clearly. If you bring the Shah to America, Iranians will go crazy. Carter himself reportedly asked, "What are you going to do when they take our people hostage?" He literally predicted what was going to happen. And then he let the Shah in anyway. In Tehran, the reaction was immediate and massive. To Iranians, this felt exactly like 1953 again. America protecting their enemy. The anger that had been building for decades boiled over. Young revolutionary students decided to make a statement. They would attack the place that represented American power in Tehran, the U.S. Embassy. It started like a normal protest. A few hundred students outside the embassy gates, carrying signs, chanting. The U.S. Marine Guards inside watched them nervously, but they had been told, "Do not shoot." President Carter wanted peace. Then suddenly, the crowd rushed forward. Students pulled out ropes and bolt cutters. They climbed the 10-foot walls. Others pushed through a weakened gate. Within minutes, they were inside. Inside the embassy, American staff ran in every direction. They threw secret documents into shredders and fire barrels. Papers were burning, phones were ringing, people were screaming. Elizabeth Swift made her emergency call to Washington. She had maybe 10 minutes before everything collapsed. And then the call ended. The embassy had fallen. In the hours that followed, 66 Americans were turned into prisoners, eyes covered, hands tied, moved from room to room so they got confused about where they were. Some were walked through the streets of Tehran while cameras filmed every second. The crowds around them screamed for their deaths. One of the hostages, a young Marine named Kevin Hermaning, just 20 years old, said later that the first night was the longest of his entire life. He could hear the chanting outside. He could smell smoke. He did not know if he would see morning. What is it really like to be a hostage? Imagine you cannot choose when to eat, when to sleep, when to speak, when to move. Imagine every single day starting with the knowledge that today might be your last. That is what 52 remaining Americans lived through for over a year. 14 people were released in mid-November, women and Black Americans. But 52 stayed behind, and their situation was not getting better. The student captors kept saying, "We do not hate you personally. We hate your government." And then they would do fake executions to scare the hostages into giving information. Multiple hostages have talked about being walked outside at night, hearing the click of a gun, and thinking that was the end. It was not real, but the fear was completely real. They could barely talk to their families. Sometimes a censored letter arrived, maybe a few minutes on the phone every few weeks. Families back in America had no idea if their loved ones were okay. But most of the hostages did not break. They looked out for each other. They tapped on walls to communicate in code. Some started Bible study groups. Some exercised in tiny rooms. One man taught himself to play chess with an imaginary opponent just to keep his brain working. They were not just waiting. They were fighting to stay human. But here's something most people do not know about this story. When the students stormed the embassy on November 4th, 6 Americans managed to slip out through a side door in the chaos. Robert Anders, Cora and Mark Lyjek, Joseph and Kathleen Stafford, and Lee Schatz. They had nowhere to go. They tried the British embassy. Protesters were there too. They tried the Canadian embassy. Surrounded. 6 Americans, alone, in a city that hated America. Then a Canadian diplomat named John Sheardown did something incredibly brave. He said, "Come in. You can hide here." The Canadian ambassador, Ken Taylor, agreed. And for 79 days, almost 3 months, those 6 Americans hid inside Canadian homes in Tehran. Every day they woke up not knowing if someone had found out. They watched the hostage crisis unfold on television from inside hiding. They barely went outside. Every knock on the door made their hearts stop. Meanwhile, the CIA was working on the craziest plan anyone had ever heard. What if one phone call could change the history of the whole world? Not a big speech, not a war announcement, just one phone call from one scared woman in a burning building. A woman named Elizabeth Swift picked up the phone inside the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. Her hands were shaking. Her voice was cracking. She called the U.S. government in Washington, D.C., and said just a few words. "Hundreds of people have jumped over our walls. They are inside our building. There's fire everywhere." And then she said 4 words that nobody ever wants to say. "We are going down." The line went dead. And just like that, 66 Americans inside that embassy became prisoners. Not in a war zone, not on a battlefield, inside their own embassy, in the middle of a city. Their eyes were covered with cloth. Their hands were tied behind their backs. And then they were walked through the streets of Tehran while thousands of people screamed for their deaths. The whole world watched it live on television. The most powerful country in the world, America, could not save its own people. And those 66 people had no idea when or if they would ever go home. This is not just a story about a hostage crisis. This is a story about oil, power, betrayal, and revenge. About a fake Hollywood movie that saved 6 people from the most dangerous city on Earth. About a rescue mission that exploded in the desert before it even started. And about 444 days that broke a U.S. president, changed the Middle East forever, and left a wound that still has not healed today. Let's go back to the very beginning, because this story starts long before 1979. It starts with oil and greed and a decision that changed everything. What if one phone call could change the history of the whole world? Not a big speech, not a war announcement, just one phone call from one scared woman in a burning building. A woman named Elizabeth Swift picked up the phone inside the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. Her hands were shaking. Her voice was cracking. She called the U.S. government in Washington, D.C., and said just a few words. "Hundreds of people have jumped over our walls. They are inside our building. There's fire everywhere." And then she said 4 words that nobody ever wants to say. "We are going down." The line went dead. And just like that, 66 Americans inside that embassy became prisoners. Not in a war zone, not on a battlefield, inside their own embassy, in the middle of a city. Their eyes were covered with cloth, their hands were tied behind their backs, and then they were walked through the streets of Tehran while thousands of people screamed for their deaths. The whole world watched it live on television. The most powerful country in the world, America, could not save its own people. And those 66 people had no idea when or if they would ever go home. This is not just a story about a hostage crisis. This is a story about oil, power, betrayal, and revenge. About a fake Hollywood movie that saved 6 people from the most dangerous city on Earth. About a rescue mission that exploded in the desert before it even started. And about 444 days that broke a U.S. president, changed the Middle East forever, and left a wound that still has not healed today. Let's go back to the very beginning, because this story starts long before 1979. It starts with oil and greed and a decision that changed everything. November 4th, 1980. Exactly 1 year after the hostages were taken, America voted. Ronald Reagan won by a massive amount. Carter won only 6 states out of 50. It was one of the biggest losses by a sitting president in American history. The hostage crisis had done something no opponent could do. It made Carter look completely powerless. The failed rescue, the 444 days with no solution, a nation watching its people stay captive. Americans made their decision. But here is where the story gets darker. Years later, a serious allegation came out. Some people said Reagan's team had secretly made a deal with Iran. Delay releasing the hostages until after the election, so Carter gets no credit. The U.S. Congress investigated this twice in the 1990s. They found no direct evidence of a deal, but the timing was almost impossible to ignore. Iran held the hostages through Carter's entire presidency and released them on the exact day Reagan was sworn in. Not a day early, not an hour early. Minutes after Reagan took the oath. The truth may never be fully known. In July 1980, the Shah died from cancer in Egypt. One of Iran's main demands, hand over the Shah, was now pointless. And then, in September 1980, Iraq invaded Iran. Suddenly, Iran had bigger problems than humiliating America. They needed weapons. They needed their frozen money back. They needed to stop being isolated from the world. Secret talks started through Algeria, the country that acted as the middleman. Iran wanted their $12 billion in frozen American banks returned. A promise America would never interfere in Iran again. All legal cases against Iran dropped. America agreed to most of it. On January 19, 1981, the deal was signed in Algiers. And then Iran waited 1 more day to release the hostages. January 20, 1981, was Ronald Reagan's first day as president. Minutes after Reagan finished his oath of office, Iran released the 52 hostages. The message was crystal clear. Jimmy Carter will not get the credit for this. 444 days. That is how long those 52 people were held prisoner. When the plane carrying the freed hostages touched down in America, the country stopped. Across America, people had tied yellow ribbons on trees to remember the hostages. Now those ribbons came down and parades went up. The hostages were welcomed like war heroes coming home from battle. But many of them felt something complicated inside. Yes, they were happy to be home, but they also carried deep wounds. And they knew 8 American soldiers had died in the desert trying to save them. Those men never came home. Many hostages struggled for years after returning. Some marriages could not survive what happened. Some could not sleep without nightmares for a long time. The trauma from 444 days of captivity did not disappear just because the door opened. And the America they came back to had changed. It was harder, less trusting, less patient. The hostage crisis had introduced a new kind of fear in America, that its people were not safe anywhere in the world. 45 years have passed, and the damage from those 444 days is still visible. The U.S. Embassy in Tehran has never reopened. Today it is called the Den of Espionage Museum, run by Iran's Revolutionary Guard. Inside, they display the shredded CIA documents, reassembled piece by piece. They sell anti-American posters. Iranian school children take field trips there to learn about America's crimes. America and Iran have had 0 official diplomatic relations since 1980. No embassy, no ambassador, not even direct phone lines between governments. If the two countries need to communicate, they go through a third country. This is one of the longest diplomatic freezes in modern history. Every big event between America and Iran since 1979 lives in the shadow of the hostage crisis. The nuclear deal in 2015, the killing of General Soleimani in 2020, the tensions happening right now. All of it connects back to November 4th, 1979. Staff Sergeant Dewey Johnson, Sergeant John Harvey, Corporal George Holmes, Sergeant Joel Mayo, Staff Sergeant Lyndon Boise, Tech Sergeant Harold Lewis, Major Richard Bakke, Captain Lynn McIntosh. Say their names. Remember them. History never forgets, even when we do. Let us step back now and ask the big question. What does all of this mean? The Iran hostage crisis was not an accident. It was not random crazy people doing something crazy. It was the result of decisions made over decades that pushed ordinary people to a breaking point. When the CIA overthrew Iran's elected government in 1953, it saved British oil profits. But it also planted a seed of rage that grew for 26 years. When the Shah tortured his own people with American-trained police, America looked the other way. When Carter let the Shah into America, despite every warning, that seed finally exploded. None of this means what happened to those 52 hostages was okay. Most of them were just regular people doing their jobs. They paid the price for decisions other people made. That is deeply unfair. But there is a bigger truth here. When powerful countries treat weaker ones like chess pieces, the anger builds and builds and builds until one day it explodes. The hostage crisis was Iran's explosion. And this pattern did not end in 1981. The names change, the countries change, but the pattern stays the same. Somewhere in America, the men and women who spent 444 days blindfolded and bound, they carry that year inside them still, not as a memory, not as a story, as a scar that never fully goes away. History always sends the bill. Always.